The Unnatural Preservation of the Living Dead. Reginald Gardner was a peculiar fellow, to say the least. While most people enjoy games for the thrill of winning, Gardner had a different approach. He believed in the philosophy of winning back in games involving fortune, but in intellectual games, he was more interested in mastering the rules. Once he understood the game, his interest quickly waned. I remember one evening, after finishing a game of Japanese chess, I offered him tea. As usual, I was hoping to gain some insightful knowledge from my psychiatrist friend, but instead, he made some snarky remarks about the game. Desperate to steer the conversation towards something more meaningful, I shared my recent encounter with a chatty post office clerk. Gardner's initial reaction seemed like a joke, but I noticed a subtle change in his demeanor. A wrinkle formed on his forehead, a telltale sign of an unpleasant memory. "What a strange turn of phrase," Gardner said, breaking the silence. I explained that it was just a hyperbole, a literary device to emphasize the clerk's talkative nature. Gardner seemed intrigued and shared a story about his time at the Cambridge clinic. As he spoke, I could tell that the memory was hazy, and he struggled to recall the details. Nevertheless, I listened intently, eager to learn more about the enigmatic Dr. Gardner. The peculiar case of the occultist patient continued to perplex Dr. Reginald Gardner as the days passed. Despite his initial diagnosis and attempts at sedation, the patient continued to mutter incomprehensibly without any signs of exhaustion. The doctor consulted with his colleagues and even sought the advice of outside specialists, but no one could offer a satisfactory explanation for the patient's condition. As the days turned into weeks, the staff at Cambridge Asylum began to feel a sense of unease. Some whispered that the patient was possessed by a malevolent spirit, while others speculated that he had unlocked some sort of mystical power that was driving him mad. The more pragmatic members of the staff dismissed such notions as mere superstition, but even they were at a loss to explain the patient's unrelenting state. Dr. Gardner, however, refused to give up on the case. He spent countless hours studying the patient's behavior, monitoring his vitals, and poring over his medical history. He even went so far as to experiment with alternative treatments, including hypnosis and acupuncture, but nothing seemed to make a difference. One day, while poring over his notes, Dr. Gardner noticed a pattern in the patient's ramblings. Although the words themselves were nonsensical, there was a rhythm and a cadence to them that seemed almost musical. Intrigued, the doctor began to record the patient's mutterings and play them back at different speeds. To his amazement, he discovered that when played at a certain speed, the patient's mutterings formed a coherent message, a message that hinted at a vast, hidden knowledge that lay just beyond the boundaries of human perception. With renewed excitement, Dr. Gardner began to explore the possibility that the patient had somehow tapped into a higher plane of consciousness, and that his condition was not a disorder at all, but a gift. In the months that followed, Dr. Gardner devoted himself to unlocking the secrets of the occultist patient's mind. He worked tirelessly, experimenting with different techniques and approaches, until finally, one day, he had a breakthrough. With a sense of awe and wonder, he realized that he had uncovered something truly extraordinary, something that would change the course of psychiatric science forever. And so, the patient who had once been a source of fear and confusion became a beacon of hope and inspiration, a living testament to the infinite potential of the human mind. After the second day of what could no longer be called a mere attack, the patient's condition remained unchanged. His incessant, unintelligible muttering had become routine, but what stunned us was his physical appearance. Despite weeks without food or water, he looked healthy, almost robust. Even more perplexing, he did not grow any facial hair or nails, and his body had stopped responding to external stimuli. His metabolism seemed to have ceased altogether. The only thing that continued unabated was the strange, terrifying muttering that filled the air and disturbed even the most unflappable among us. As the weeks passed, the patient became a forgotten curiosity, relegated to a small closet in the attic. Only I and one of the orderlies, a former drug addict, visited him, and even the orderlies seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure during these visits. I resorted to using earplugs made of wax-soaked cotton to protect myself from the patient's incomprehensible speech. My colleagues and I initially believed that the patient's condition was the result of some natural, but as yet unknown, factors. However, as time went on, I became increasingly convinced that there was something otherworldly at play. I decided to record the patient's muttering on a gramophone, hoping to decipher it myself or with the help of experts in the field of unusual phenomena. To my horror, the record began to melt, turning into a shapeless lump of resin that burned through the body of the gramophone. The unnaturalness of it all left me shaken. Undeterred, I resorted to a simpler, if less revealing, method of recording the patient's speech, writing it down in letters. Even this proved challenging, as the patient's speech was monotonous and difficult to decipher. After filling several pages, I could find no meaning in the scribbled letters. I called on friends and experts to help me make sense of it all. It is worth noting that the individuals mentioned previously, whom I have described on multiple occasions, had connections to the world of the occult. However, they did not participate as adepts or practitioners, but rather as specialists involved in overseeing and advising. While their activities were not a direct opposition to the occult, in some cases, their assistance and guidance contributed to the resistance against malevolent forces that threaten society or individuals. Our encounter took place in London, as per usual, in a house that boasted a magnificent view of the Black Brothers Bridge, a detail that always piqued my curiosity. I recounted the unpleasant incident at the Cambridge Asylum and offered my garbled transcription for inspection. This sparked a discussion amongst our council, during which various options for deciphering the text were explored. However, none of us were certain if the text had any meaning at all. As the conversation continued, I found myself losing focus, feeling drained and disheartened. I struggled to understand my interlocutors and succumbed to a state of listlessness. It wasn't until one of the most respected experts, whom we fondly referred to as the Elder, arrived that my spirits were lifted. He was a true bibliophile, having devoted his entire adult life to poring over books in libraries around the world, including grimoires that were not accessible to the public. After examining the recording through an antique lorgnette, he calmly declared that no transcription was necessary. "Why not?" we exclaimed. "Have you managed to uncover the meaning behind the text?" On this occasion, my friends, I will respond with the wise words of Confucius: it is difficult to find a black cat in a dark room, especially if it is not there. There is no cat, or meaning, in the text. It is simply a jumbled mess of letters, and your patient's speech, Gardner, is nothing more than a disordered collection of sounds. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. It meant that we were dealing with a mental disorder, albeit an exceptionally peculiar and exaggerated one. Several minutes of silence followed, and then one of the participants in the meeting asked, "What about the gramophone? Could it be a concentrated exposure to the body's electromagnetic radiation, somehow stimulated and vastly amplified?" As the Elder spoke, a shiver ran down my spine. The idea of attempting to attain eternal life seemed like a fool's errand, and the thought of invoking an otherworldly force made me feel uneasy. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person would be willing to take such a risk. The Elder continued, "The Von Lutz method is not something to be trifled with. It requires a deep understanding of the occult and the ability to control one's own mind. Those who are not properly prepared run the risk of losing their sanity or worse." I couldn't help but think of my patient and how he had fallen victim to his own ignorance. Had he known more about the occult, he may have thought twice before attempting such a dangerous ritual. The Elder went on to explain that the entity known as the Unnamable was not something to be taken lightly. Its very existence defied the laws of nature, and its power was beyond human comprehension. Those who attempted to invoke its name were not only risking their own lives but the very fabric of reality itself. As the meeting drew to a close, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The occult was a dangerous realm, one that should not be entered lightly. The Von Lutz method and the entity it invoked were not to be taken lightly, and I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those foolish enough to seek them out. The attempt to utter the unutterable turned into a futile, meaningless stream of incomprehensible sounds emanating from the lips of a feeble-minded dummy. However, the dark magic that had been cast upon him endowed this quasi-human with unnatural physical strength. The spellbound creature had no need for sustenance, and according to some rumors, not even air was required. In this case, The sounds were made solely through the vibrations of the tongue, and he seemed to be preserved in a state of selective suspended animation, known as parabiosis. In theory, this granted him eternal life, but not the kind he desired. Furthermore, in practice, his grotesque existence was by no means eternal, as witchcraft does not provide absolute invulnerability from external dangers. If the tale seemed too brief for your liking, I apologize. However, I am bound by professional secrecy and cannot reveal more. Is he still confined to the attic at Cambridge Asylum? I asked, handing Gardner a fresh cup of tea. In that case, I doubt he would still be within the walls of the institution, Gardner replied. After our meeting, I mustered the courage to visit the attic and inquire about the occultist's condition. I was immediately overcome by an ominous voice that seemed to drill into my head with an inhuman rhythm, and a black aura that permeated the entire building. Sometimes, I felt the urge to intervene, to put an end to his madness. As for the malevolent orderly, he once confided in me that he intended to destroy the cursed mummy. I had no doubt that he would follow through on his threat. Frankly, I had no desire to prevent it. Shortly thereafter, the orderly disappeared from the asylum, leaving behind a note that I cannot recount due to its profanity-laden content. The on-duty nurse soon discovered the loss of the entire supply of strychnine. Knowing what had occurred, I rushed to the attic. The dose of poison that the orderly had injected into the rambling occultist was potent enough to fell a dozen lions, yet he remained alive. His body convulsed, his tongue gnashing against his teeth, his muscles straining to their limits. Only hisses and sobs emerged from his mouth, quickly fading into silence. The eldest expert had been correct. The spell did not provide complete protection from fatal external influences. Finally, after a brief time, the occultist, reduced to a shell of his former self, fell still. I was too afraid to confirm whether he still clung to life, but in any event, the concept of natural had lost its meaning for him. A few hours later, an unprecedented storm swept through our region. I trust you recall it. The accompanying thunderstorm was the most intense I had ever witnessed. The storm brought about an ending that brought to mind an account from Devonshire in 1638, where a great fireball had entered a village church, causing considerable destruction and killing several people. At Cambridge Asylum, a peculiar purple ball of lightning descended upon the building, moving in a capricious trajectory that gave the impression, perhaps due to involuntary autosuggestion, of artificial direction. The lightning shattered a window in the attic room and incinerated the occultist's body. What a ghastly demise! Yes, chilling, and, I suspect, not entirely accidental, Gardner mused. Since then, the word infinity has taken on a unique significance for me.